The bells ring before the sun has risen. You do not wake from sleep. You wake from silence. It is cold. The kind of cold that lives not only in the stones of the monastery walls, but inside your very breath. You open your eyes not in defiance of the darkness, but because you were already awake. You always are. The mattress beneath you is made of straw, flattened by years of turning. It rustles as you sit up, more a sigh than a sound. You are not supposed to make noise, not even when you're alone. You reach for your robes. They are simple, scratchy. The same shade of washed-out brown as every other monk in this house of God. The candle you light is short, half-used, its wax pooled at the base like some sleeping creature refusing to die. There are no clocks here, only bells, and they have begun to ring. You shuffle down a narrow stone hallway. Your footsteps are light, trained not to echo. Your brothers move with you, silent, hooded shadows gliding across ancient tiles. You do not greet each other. You are not supposed to. Somewhere in the chapel, incense has been burning since midnight. It mixes with the smell of mold and centuries-old wood. The smoke curls like a ghost, trailing above your heads, making halos above those too tired to believe in them anymore. You kneel. The stone bites through the cloth of your robe. You close your eyes, and you begin the first prayers of the day. This is the life of a monk in the late Middle Ages. Not a priest, not a bishop, not a man of sermons and wine and Latin. Just a monk. A footnote in God's manuscript. You eat when the bell allows it. You sleep when the bell allows it. You speak only when silence is no longer the holier choice. And so you live, day after day, year after year. But here is the question. What if you hated it? What if, sometime after your 5th winter inside these walls, or maybe your 10th, you realized you no longer loved God? What if your prayers were empty syllables mouthed out of habit? What if you did not care for the psalms, or the cold, or the silence? What if you wanted out? Could you leave? Could you simply walk away from the cloister one morning, take off your robe, and become a man again? History would tell you no. But the truth, as always, is not so easily bound. There are stories, half buried in parish records, cloister archives, and ecclesiastical whispers, of men who tried. Some failed. Some disappeared. A few were never seen again. And others were dragged back. By brothers, by church, by guilt. The vow you take as a monk is not a job contract. It is a lifelong oath, a sacred bond, a kind of spiritual marriage. You do not resign. You do not take a sabbatical. You belong to the monastery now, to the abbot, to the rule, to God. And still, some tried. Imagine a man, 20 years old, maybe younger, sent to the monastery because his family had no dowry for him, because his older brother inherited the land, because there was no other future. He is not devout. He is not even sure he believes. But he wears the robes. He chants the prayers. And every night, as the candle sputters beside his bed, he dreams of walking barefoot into the woods and never returning. Imagine that man years later. His knees ruined from kneeling. His eyes faded from candlelight. The hunger in his belly dulled by years of discipline. But not the hunger in his soul. He hears the bell again. And he asks himself just once in a whisper he will never admit aloud, "Can I leave?" The bell tolls louder in his mind than in the chapel. He has read the stories, knows the punishments, excommunication, flogging, eternal damnation. But something in him stirs. Maybe he does not believe in damnation anymore. Maybe he just wants to see a woman's face again. Maybe he just wants to feel grass beneath his feet, not stone. And so he waits for a foggy night, for a moment when the bell doesn't ring on time, for one step beyond the cloister wall. Just one. And now, centuries later, we ask, did he make it? Did anyone? What happened to those who tried? Were they chased down like heretics? Were they forgiven? Were they forgotten? Tonight we follow their footprints in the dark. We listen to their silence. We ask what it meant to walk away from the only life God would allow them. The bells are ringing again, not to call you to prayer, but to call you into the story. Lay back, close your eyes, and let us begin. The monastery is not a prison. It has no iron bars, no shackles. But make no mistake, once inside your world becomes very small. Not because you are chained, but because everything outside these walls is declared irrelevant. You wake before dawn. You sleep after sunset. In between, you do not live so much as you endure. Inside the cloister, the rhythm is eternal. Time does not move forward, it circles. Each hour is named by its prayer. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. They are not just rituals. They are architecture. They are the bones of the day. You do not own your hours. You serve them. The morning begins with silence. No one speaks unless commanded. You rise from your bed, whisper the psalms you've memorized by heart, and walk barefoot across cold stone toward the chapel. There is no music, not unless it's sacred. No laughter unless it's accidental. And no warmth unless it comes from within. You kneel on the hard flagstone floor. The chapel is damp, smelling of wax and mildew and breath held too long. The air is heavy. The light, if any, is from narrow stained glass windows filtering in weak blue dawn. The only colors you ever see are brown, gray, the occasional flicker of gold leaf in a sacred text. Everything else is dust. Once prayers end, there is work. And monks do not simply pray. They labor. In the scriptorium, men hunched over parchment scrape words into vellum with aching hands. Ink freezes in the winter. Candles burn low. A single mistake, one blot of ink, one slip of the quill, and hours of scripture must be scraped away and begun again. There is no joy in it, only discipline. And discipline is what salvation demands. Outside in the gardens, monks tend vegetables. Digging, hoeing, bending. Each movement watched by the prior, each breath weighed against expectations. The monastery must be self-sufficient. God will not send angels to milk your goats. There is no breakfast, not unless it's a feast day. And even then, it might only be bread and water. Lunch, if you can call it that, comes after the third hour. Pottage, boiled grains, maybe leeks if it's summer. Meat? Only on special occasions, and even then not for everyone. You eat in silence, while another monk reads scripture aloud from a pulpit. You do not taste food. You receive it. To enjoy it is to flirt with gluttony. Somewhere in this silence you remember you had a name once. Outside the walls you were Thomas or Gerard or Michael. But here you are Brother Simeon or Brother Anselm. You were given your new name when you took your vows. It is not just a name. It is a tombstone. The man you were is gone. Dead by choice. Buried in ritual. There are rules for everything. How to stand. How to sit. Where to walk. What eye to look with when you gaze at the abbot. Even your thoughts are not your own. You are expected to confess every impure idea, every flicker of doubt, every dream that did not take place on holy ground. And so, you learn to bury even your sins in silence. If you are lucky, you will be allowed to copy books. If you are strong, you'll be sent to the vineyard or the granary or the bakery. If you are neither, you'll be sweeping cloisters and cleaning privies. But no task is beneath you. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Even the abbot eats from the same bowl. And yet, there are those who find peace in this rhythm. They believe that in surrendering all things they gain eternity. That the stillness is not a prison but a doorway. That by killing the self they can find the divine. But what if you don't feel it? What if you never did? You were told that discipline would lead to revelation. But years have passed and all you feel is hollow. Not spiritual emptiness, but the gnawing kind. The kind that makes your joints ache when you lie down. The kind that grows louder every time the bell rings. telling you what to do, how to pray, when to eat, what not to feel. You're not alone. Not really. There are others like you. You recognize it in the way they kneel, in the way they linger by the gate a second too long, in the flickers of unrest behind closed eyelids. But no one speaks of it. No one dares. Because to say the words, "I don't want to be here," is to invite eternal shame. To reject the monastery is to reject God. To reject God is to risk hell. And yet, the outside world still exists. You hear it in travelers' voices when they pass. You see it in the faces of peasants who bring barley to the door. You dream of it in flickering moments. A tavern at dusk. A girl with red hair. The warmth of fire not built by prayer. You try to confess the dreams. But the dreams return. One day while hauling wood, you find a small bird lying on the ground. Its wing is broken. It flutters feebly, unable to rise. You scoop it into your hand and hide it beneath your robes. That night, while your brothers sleep, you feed it crumbs. The next morning it is gone. You never saw it fly. But something in you believes it did. And that belief, that the wing healed, that the bird escaped, that maybe you can too, becomes your heresy. So you work and pray and kneel and ache and wait, because the walls of the monastery are tall, but your longing is taller, because the silence is deep, but your hunger is deeper, because maybe, just maybe, there is a way out. The bells ring again. You rise. You join the others in the courtyard. The sky is overcast. The wind smells like wet stone. You pull your hood low. You say nothing, but in your heart, you say it over and over. I do not belong here. I do not belong here. I do not belong here. There is no iron chain on your ankle, no soldier at the gate, no lock on your cell. And yet you are not free, because a monk is not held by walls. He is held by vows. When you entered the monastery, you made a promise, not a metaphor, not a symbol, a vow, sacred, binding, eternal. Once spoken, it tied you to the life of a monk not in habit, but in soul. And you made three. The first was the vow of poverty. You gave up all worldly possessions. Your clothes, your coin, your books, if you had any, even your name. You walked into the cloister carrying only your breath. And even that, some would say, now belonged to God. From this day forward, nothing was yours. Not your bed, not your food, not your hands, your voice, your body. Everything was shared, and nothing could be claimed. You were taught, the more you give up, the more you are saved. And so you let go, until you began to wonder what remained. The second was the vow of chastity. No touching, no glancing, no lingering thoughts, no longing. To love a woman was to divide your soul. To desire was to pollute the purity of your spirit. Even affection for your fellow brothers was suspect, unless properly framed in the language of divine charity. You slept in common dormitories. You bathed in silence. You confessed even your dreams. And when the dreams didn't stop, you fasted. You prayed harder. You lashed your thighs with cords in the cold of night, believing pain would drown the memory of her eyes. But it never did. And the third vow, the most terrible, the most invisible, the one that quietly broke the man inside you, without leaving a mark, was the vow of obedience. This vow made you less than a man. You no longer had a will, no opinions, no doubts, only orders. You obeyed the abbot as you would obey Christ, without hesitation, without question, without even understanding. If he told you to fast, you fasted. If he told you to copy scripture until your fingers bled, you did. If he ordered you to kneel in the rain until morning, you obeyed. Because disobedience wasn't just rebellion, it was heresy. The church was clear. Your body is weak. Your mind is prideful. Your will is flawed. Only by surrendering it to God, through your superior, Can you be made whole? You were told that your vow of obedience would save your soul. But it never felt like salvation. It felt like erasure. And still there were layers beneath these vows. Not just spiritual but legal. Canon law, the law of the church, declared that to break your vow was to sin. To walk away from your vows was to commit apostasy. To deny your calling was to spit in the face of God. And in some cases, to be punished by man. If you left the monastery without permission, without release, you could be pursued, dragged back, tried in an ecclesiastical court, flagellated, excommunicated, even imprisoned. Yes, monasteries had cells of their own, not for criminals, but for monks who strayed. And worst of all was the public shame. In a world where salvation was everything, where damnation was not a metaphor, to be known as a vow breaker was to be untouchable. You could not marry. You could not work. You could not be buried in consecrated ground. You became a ghost, wandering outside the walls that once held you, less free than you ever were inside. There were ways, legal ways, to leave, but they were rare, difficult, often impossible. You could petition the abbot, beg to be released, cite sickness, madness, spiritual unfitness. But such releases were almost never granted. Why? Because your vow wasn't made to the abbot, or the monastery, or even the church. It was made to God, and only the Pope himself could dissolve it. And so you stayed, not because you believed, not because you loved, but because you had no path out. The door behind you had vanished, and the world had already forgotten your name. Some monks tried to find freedom within the walls. They took solace in gardening, in the act of copying poetry, in private devotion to obscure saints. Some found peace, others found madness. There are records, fragmented and buried, of monks who spoke to no one for years, who scratched symbols into their skin, who wept at night into their pillows, convinced the devil had entered their hearts. They were not punished. They were pitied, or worse, ignored, because to question the vow was to question the system, and the system could not be wrong. Imagine this. A young man, trembling, stands before the altar. He repeats the words. He takes the robe. He shaves his head. He kneels. But in his heart, he knows. He knows he has made a mistake. Not a sin, not a crime. Just a mistake. A human, fallible, irreversible mistake. And now he must live with it, day after day, year after year, until death, or madness, or mercy takes him. They told him the vows were sacred. They told him the vows would protect him. They told him the vows would bring him closer to God. But he does not feel God. He only feels stone, and silence, and the weight of chains he cannot see, but can never forget. Outside, the wind blows through the trees. Somewhere a child laughs. A dog barks. A woman hums to herself while kneading dough. Inside the cloister, a bell rings. He kneels. He closes his eyes. He opens his mouth and speaks words that no longer mean anything, because his vow was not just to serve. It was to vanish. And he has. They never made a sound. The rebels, they did not shout. They did not preach. They did not storm out through the front gate. They simply disappeared. Every monastery has its stories. The brother who went to draw water and never returned. The novice who was there one compline and gone the next. The empty bed, the folded robe, the sandals neatly placed at the foot of the straw mattress. No one asked questions. They all knew. They just didn't say it, because to say the words, "He ran," was to suggest it could be done. Most left in winter. The cold covered their steps. The fog hid their movements. And no one wanted to chase someone through the snow. Some left in spring, when the roads softened, when the air didn't bite, when the scent of fields and blossom reminded them that life, somewhere out there, was blooming again. Not all succeeded. Many were caught, dragged back, beaten, humiliated. A monk named Petrus of Ghent once fled his cloister in the year 1297. He made it as far as Bruges before a fellow monk spotted him in a market, selling hand-bound books for coin. He was returned in chains, forced to kneel naked before the refectory while his brothers ate. He was whipped in silence. His punishment was read aloud, so the others would remember. He never tried again. But he also never spoke again. Not for 16 years until his death. But not all stories end in return. There is a parchment in the archives of Durham Priory, dated 1364. It mentions a man, Brother Matthew, who departed his post unlawfully. That's all it says. No punishment. No return. Just a disappearance. No one knows what happened to him. Did he die in the woods? Did he change his name and marry in a village? Did he regret it and live out his days hiding from both the church and God? Or did he feel the wind on his face and know, at last, what it meant to breathe? These men were not loud. They were not leaders. They did not write manifestos. They did not seek to bring down the church. They just wanted out of the rhythm, out of the silence, out of the vow. And that, in the eyes of the church, was betrayal enough. To flee a monastery was not just to reject your brothers. It was to reject your own soul. You were a man married to God. To walk away from the monastery was a kind of divorce, the unthinkable kind. And there was no legal system for spiritual divorce in the 14th century. Only punishment, or disappearance. And yet, there were those who planned. They studied the guards, if any. They noted which doors creaked and which didn't. They gathered crusts of bread, stashed them beneath their robes. Some even carved copies of keys from soft wax and bone, not to commit a crime, but to reclaim their life. Some found allies, a brother who looked the other way, a villager who offered shelter, a woman who still remembered their name from the days before the robe. A few made deals. They approached the bishop. They begged for release. Some claimed illness. Others claimed madness. One monk in 1421 wrote that, "A devil walks with me at night and sings to me of wine and women." Was he lying? Was he mad? Or was that his only way out? Either way, the bishop declared him spiritually unfit and sent him away. He was never heard from again. For others, release came not through escape, but through war. In 1536, during the English dissolution of the monasteries, many monks were forcibly expelled. Henry VIII's men closed abbeys, seized lands, and burned libraries. Some monks wept. Others rejoiced, because the vow was broken for them. Freedom, they realized, didn't always come from rebellion. Sometimes it came from politics. But for centuries before that, escape had only two paths: run or rot. And still most never ran. Most endured. They died in their robes. They were buried in cloistered graves. Their names recorded only in faded rolls beneath the heading, "He was obedient unto death." But somewhere in the folds of time, there were footsteps, half erased by weather, half remembered by stone. The footsteps of those who could not bear one more dawn in silence, who risked the lash, the curse, and the weight of eternal sin, just to feel free. And so we ask, were they wrong? Were they cowards? Traitors? Sinners? Or were they simply men? Men who once believed, but who found in time that belief is not always enough to live on? You may think of them as weak, but consider this. In an age where the soul meant more than the body, where eternal fire was not a metaphor but a fear as real as hunger, to risk damnation for a sliver of freedom took a kind of courage we can scarcely imagine today. Somewhere in a tavern on the edge of a forest, a traveler once lifted a mug of ale, his robe long since traded for wool and dust, and he said nothing. When the monk at the next table spoke of sin, because silence, too, can be a kind of prayer, and survival, a kind of faith. And so the bells ring again. But this time, you listen differently. You know now, not all men who kneel do so willingly. Some stay, and some slip into the shadows, their footprints fading into mist, their names lost, but their rebellion echoing, soft as a breath, sharp as a broken vow. They say the gates of the monastery are open, that no one is chained, that the doors are not locked. But try to leave, and you will discover just how tightly silence can close around you. Because what keeps a monk inside is not the stone, it is fear. Fear of damnation, fear of punishment, and most of all, fear of shame. To run is one sin, to be caught is another. Because now you're not just a man who broke his vow. You are a spectacle, a warning, a living reminder of what happens when obedience fails. The punishments were rarely public, but they were never private. Let us begin with discipline. The church preferred to avoid blood, so they turned to other tools. Flagellation, a whip of knotted cords, sometimes leather, sometimes studded with iron barbs, lashed across the back of a man kneeling half naked before the altar. 1 stroke for every day absent, 10 strokes for speaking heresy, 50 for attempting to flee. It was not administered by guards, but by brothers, sometimes even by the prior himself. Each lash followed by a psalm. Each psalm a plea for forgiveness. But forgiveness was slow. The scars stayed. Isolation. A cell barely larger than a coffin. No window. No fire. Only a bowl of cold water and a hunk of black bread. No words. No light. No human voice for days. Some monks were kept there a week. Some a month. Some longer. Manual penance. Forced to kneel outside the chapel from sunrise to sunset. Bare knees on gravel. In winter. While the others walked past. Or scraping the floor of the refectory with a knife. Cleansing it not of dirt, but of spiritual impurity. One monk in 1378 was ordered to clean the latrines by hand, every day for a year. He died of illness before the year was out. But worse than any of these was the public confession. Imagine, you are made to stand before the community, dozens of eyes upon you, hooded solemn, watching not with hatred but with cold disappointment. You must name your sin aloud, every word. You must admit you tried to run, that you abandoned your vow, that you doubted God. And then you must beg for forgiveness, not once, not in silence, but repeatedly. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault. Sometimes, you were made to lie flat on the chapel floor while your brothers stepped over you to receive communion. Sometimes you were sent to beg barefoot through nearby villages, not for food, but for pardon, carrying a sign that said, I broke my vow. And it worked, because punishment wasn't just about pain, it was about breaking the soul. To make you hate yourself more than the monastery ever could. To make you believe that the desire for freedom was the sin, not the vow, not the system, not the silence. You were the problem. And if the punishments didn't work, there was excommunication, the ultimate weapon. You weren't just cast out of the monastery. You were cast out of God's grace. You couldn't take communion. You couldn't be buried in holy ground. You were spiritually dead. Even if your body still walked, people feared excommunicates. They wouldn't feed them, wouldn't hire them, wouldn't look them in the eye. To help a man damned by the church was to risk damnation yourself. And so, exiled monks wandered the countryside, starving, cold, nameless. They died in ditches, alone, unshriven, unforgiven. And yet, some monks still ran, which tells you something about how unbearable life had become for them, that they would rather risk pain, shame, and eternal hell than kneel one more time at the altar of obedience. But most monks did not run, not because they were happy, not because they were saints, but because the punishment was always louder than the desire, because the shame of trying and failing was worse than the despair of staying. Even those who secretly wanted to leave did not dare admit it. They watched the punishment. They whispered prayers. They thanked God that it was not them. And then they went back to work, back to silence, back to obedience, grateful to suffer only in secret. The monastery was not a prison, but it knew how to make a man fear freedom, not by denying it, but by punishing the thought of it. Because once you had been punished, you were marked. Even if you stayed, even if you repented, even if you lived out your years in silent penance, you were no longer a monk. You were a failure who returned. A man whose name, even in whispered prayer, was always followed by a pause, a glance, a question. Did he ever really believe? Can a broken vow be truly mended? What kind of man runs from God and then comes crawling back? That's what made the punishment so cruel. Not the lash, not the cold, not the cell, but the knowing, the look in the eyes of your brothers, the shift in the way the abbot said your name, the echo of your own doubt, looping endlessly through the silence you once called sacred. Some never recovered. They obeyed. They prayed. They endured. But they never believed again. The monastery broke no bones. It spilled little blood, but it knew how to shatter a soul, how to smother a spirit with shame, how to turn silence into judgment, and obedience into a kind of slow, sacred death. And so the bell rings, and you rise, and you kneel, because you remember the man who once ran, and you remember what they did to him, and because deep down, you know, it is better to die in silence than to live beneath the weight of your own broken vow. They said it was impossible, that once you entered the monastery you belonged to it. To leave was betrayal. To even wish to leave was sin. But was that always true? Could a monk actually get out? The answer, like most things in the Middle Ages, is layered in parchment, prayer, and politics, and sometimes in silence. Let's begin with the official path, the rare, narrow, winding legal road to release. A monk who wished to leave without fleeing could, in theory, petition for a formal dispensation, a release from vows. But it was not simple, and it was almost never approved, because the vow was sacred, and sacred things are not undone by convenience. You had to prove you were no longer fit for the religious life, that your soul had turned, or your mind had failed, or your body was falling apart. And even then, your request had to pass through the abbot, the bishop, and sometimes, if the matter was serious enough, the Pope himself. Most petitions were ignored. Some were laughed at. A few were simply destroyed. One monk in a letter dated 1412 wrote, "I have written thrice. None reply. I think they mean for me to die here." But once in a while, a door opened. Illness was the most common cause. If you became too weak to work, too ill to kneel, too frail to fast, the monastery might release you, not in compassion, but in practicality. They could not spare the resources to care for someone who could no longer serve God usefully. You were given a blessing, a crust of bread, and sent out to die in peace. They called it mercy. Madness was another path. A monk who claimed to be tormented by devils, visions, uncontrollable urges, might be deemed spiritually unfit. Some were confined, but others were dismissed, quietly, their departure hidden in euphemism. Released to the care of his family for reasons of divine unclarity. It sounded better than he screamed in his sleep and tried to eat candles. There were stranger paths still. Political influence could open doors. If you had a powerful family, a noble brother, a wealthy cousin, a father with friends in Rome, you might be transferred, reassigned, even quietly dismissed. One monk, the bastard son of a minor French baron, was released to pursue diplomatic service to Christendom, which apparently meant marrying a countess and managing vineyards. Then there were the rarest cases, those who argued, convincingly, that they had never truly made the vow, that they had been forced, that they were too young, that they were deceived. The church knew these situations existed. Young boys sent to monasteries against their will, novices who didn't understand what they were promising, men pressured into vows to save family land or reputation. So they created a loophole. A vow made under coercion is not valid in the eyes of God. But proving coercion? In a system that worshipped obedience? Almost impossible. Still, a few tried. A few succeeded. But here's the truth. Even when you could leave legally, you left with nothing. No property. No rights. No social standing. You were not a layman. You were not a priest. You were a shadow. A man who once served God, and then stepped away. People didn't trust you. They feared you. They whispered. He took the vow, and then he walked away. What else might he abandon? Some found new lives. A woman, a farm, a trade. Others wandered, half mad, half drunk, whispering psalms to themselves in alleyways. The vow left a mark, not just on the soul, but on the body. Even outside the walls, the monastery followed them, in their habits, in their silence, in their shame. And yet, despite all this, some monks did get out, and some even chose to come back. There are stories of men who wandered for years, only to return one day, ragged and weary, asking to kneel once more in the chapel where they once prayed. Some were turned away. Others were taken in. No one ever asked them why. Because the silence of a monk who has seen the world is heavier than 1,000 sermons. But not all returns were holy. Some returned as enemies. In the 16th century, during the Reformation, former monks became Protestant preachers. They denounced the church. They burned vestments. They called monasteries prisons and their abbots tyrants. One man, once Brother Stephanus of Württemberg, wrote a pamphlet titled, "Of My Escape from That Tomb of the Living." He lived in hiding for years, preaching by candlelight in barns, until one day he vanished. No grave was ever found. So, could you get out? Yes, but it was never simple, never easy, never clean. To leave the monastery was to be reborn, and not always as something better. You might find freedom. You might find ruin. You might find God again, in a woman's eyes, or a plowman's song, or a child's laughter in the market square, or you might never find anything at all, just silence, stillness, and the echo of bells that no longer summon you. The vow ends with words, but it lingers in dreams. So the question is not just, could you leave? But, would you dare? Would you risk shame, exile, hunger, eternal damnation, just to feel the wind on your face? Just to reclaim a name you almost forgot? Just to be yourself again? Some did. Most didn't. But even among those who stayed, there were men who, in the stillness of the chapel, in the heat of the summer garden, or beneath the flickering candlelight of the scriptorium, let their minds wander, let their hearts drift, let their dreams walk through doors their bodies could never pass. Because the body may be bound by vow, but the soul is still watching the road. He never left. He thought about it, yes, more times than he could count, but he never ran. He woke with the bell as he always did, pulled on his robe in silence, lit the same stub of wax candle, knew exactly how long it would last. He knelt beside the same cracked stone in the chapel, felt the same cold seep through the knees of his habit, mouthed the same psalms, words he no longer believed, spoken now out of habit more than hope. He was not old, but his eyes looked older than his years. There was a quietness in him that went deeper than the rule. Not serenity, not holiness, resignation. He had once imagined escape, pictured the gate left ajar, pictured slipping into the woods, changing his name, buying bread with a smile instead of a prayer. He had even mapped the timing. He knew when the porter took his nap. He knew which floorboard outside the dormitory door creaked. And yet, he stayed. What? He couldn't say. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was because he had once known a man who tried and never came back. Or maybe it was because he didn't know who he was. Without the silence, he had taken the vow at 17. Too young to know what he was surrendering. Too obedient to ask if he could choose otherwise. At first it had felt like virtue, then discipline, then penance, then nothing at all. The days blurred. Seasons passed. His name faded, not just in the records, but in his own mind. Sometimes in dreams, he was called by a name he hadn't heard in decades. A name spoken by a mother now long dead. A name that made his breath catch, like a bird fluttering once inside a sealed chest. But he never used it, not aloud, not even in confession, because that name belonged to a man who once lived. And he merely endured. He did his work, copied texts, tended herbs, listened to younger monks recite their lines with a tremble he recognized. He offered them no comfort. He had none to give. Once a novice asked him, "Brother, have you ever thought of leaving?" And he replied simply, "Every day." The boy blinked, then nodded, and never asked again. He watched others come and go, some with fire in their hearts, some with fear, some with absolute devotion. And sometimes when he was alone in the garden, he whispered the truth, not as a prayer, not as confession, but as memory. I could have gone. I didn't. And yet, despite everything, he was not bitter, not angry, not broken. Just empty. Like a cup used too long, its glaze worn down, still whole, but no longer shining. Years passed. He aged. His hands trembled when he wrote. His knees cracked when he knelt. He was no longer assigned chores. He sat near the fire, quiet and still, like a stone placed beside a path, not to be noticed, but always there. And then one night, he did not wake with the bell. The others found him still in bed, eyes closed, candle burned out, hands folded as if in prayer, but relaxed, not rigid, not clenched, just still. They buried him in the monastery graveyard. No headstone, just a wooden cross, a name carved into it that was not his own, but the one he had worn for decades. Brother Matthias, obedient unto death. The record books say nothing else. But sometimes in the early hours before lauds, when the frost clings to the cloister stones, and the bell rings a fraction too late, some say they feel something in the hallway. A whisper, a breath, a memory not quite gone. Some say he still walks there, not in chains, not in robes, but barefoot, with a name on his lips no one remembers. He never left. But in the end, maybe a part of him did. And now, the story ends. The candle dims. The bell is silent. And you lie in your bed, warm, free. Your name's still your own. But before sleep comes, you wonder, if it were you, if the robes were yours, would you have stayed? Or would you have run? Good night. Sleep well. And remember, not all prisons have walls. Not all freedom is escape, and not all vows are silent. Some still echo, even now,